Frank Delaney stood still for a moment at the edge of Gate 27 in Denver International Airport, his cane planted squarely on the smooth tile floor, his eyes scanning the line of early boarders. He wasn't in a rush. He never was these days. At 78, the world had slowed to match the deliberate rhythm of his stride. He had earned that right, the hard way, with bone and blood and years too heavy to count. He wore a soft tan jacket that had seen too many seasons, pressed black slacks with a crease from careful hands, and old walking shoes dulled by miles. Most people saw just that, an elderly black man, quiet and alone, maybe a little out of place in the sleek modern terminal humming with young travelers and loud announcements. But if they looked closer, they might notice the way he moved, the stiffness in his left leg, the way he avoided stepping fully on it. That wasn't age. That was history. He shifted the strap of his worn duffel bag across his shoulder and stepped forward as his boarding group was called. The gate agent gave him a polite smile, and he nodded back with quiet courtesy. No fuss. He never liked attention. He made his way slowly down the jet bridge, his hand running along the railing, each step measured and steady. Every now and then, pain shot up from the old wound in his knee, but he didn't let it show. He hadn't for decades. Seat 14C. Aisle. Extra legroom. Premium economy. He had paid the upgrade himself, cut back on groceries, skipped his prescription glasses for another month, because 5 hours without stretch room would leave him unable to walk off the plane. It wasn't a luxury. It was survival. He'd chosen this seat not just for comfort, but because he'd promised his granddaughter he would be there. Her graduation from the U.S. Naval Academy wasn't just a ceremony. It was legacy. She would be the first to wear the uniform after him, and Frank wasn't about to miss that moment. Not for anything. He reached the row and settled into 14C with care, lowering himself slowly, easing his bad leg forward until he could stretch it into the blessed few extra inches of space. A small sigh escaped him, a rare sound of relief. The cabin around him buzzed with passengers finding seats, stuffing carry-ons, clicking buckles. He tucked his duffel beneath the seat in front of him and folded his hands in his lap. He was ready. Almost. Then came the voice. "Excuse me, sir," a woman's voice said, clipped and professional. "Are you seated in 14C?" Frank looked up. The flight attendant was young, maybe in her 30s, uniform pressed, smile polished by routine. Her name tag read Kayla. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." She crouched slightly, lowering herself to his eye level, smile still in place but firm at the edges. "We have a family that got separated during booking," she began. "A mother with 2 young kids. They're in 3 different rows, and your seat, along with the 2 beside it, is the only available block where they can sit together." Frank didn't move. His brow furrowed slightly, and he glanced toward the front of the plane where he saw the mother standing in the aisle, holding a toddler, her other 2 children clustered nearby. Then he looked back at Kayla. "I booked this seat 3 months ago," he said quietly. "Medical reason. Combat injury." Kayla's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I understand, sir, and we appreciate your service. It's just for this flight." Frank felt the silence press against him like a wall. He wasn't trying to be difficult. But the thought of squeezing into a standard seat, especially one in the back, made his knee throb at the mere idea. "What's the alternative?" he asked after a pause. Kayla tapped her tablet. "Seat 32B. It's toward the rear. Middle seat." Frank blinked. "Middle?" "Yes, sir. It's the only seat currently unassigned." He didn't answer right away. He just sat there, staring down the aisle, letting the weight of her request settle like dust in his chest. 32B meant no room to extend, no aisle to lean into, no relief for the long stretch of agony that awaited him. He thought about Annapolis. About his granddaughter in her dress whites. About the promise he'd made. "I'm sorry," he said softly, "but I really can't sit back there. My leg won't make it." Kayla's expression didn't change. "We really need to seat this family together. If you choose not to move, we may not be able to close the doors." There it was. The pressure. The implication. Frank looked around. He could feel eyes on him now. Passengers watching. Judging. An old man refusing to help a mother with children. The story was writing itself before he could speak. He clenched his jaw. "This is not acceptable," he said quietly. "I'll note that, sir," Kayla replied. "But I need a decision." A breath passed. Then another. Frank unbuckled his seatbelt with a sigh that sounded like surrender. He stood slowly, gripping the headrest in front of him for support. The pain in his knee flared, sharp and unforgiving. He looked Kayla square in the eyes. "Name's Frank Delaney," he said. "Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, retired. I'd like it noted that I gave up a medically necessary seat under pressure." Kayla gave a brisk nod and turned to wave the family forward. Frank gathered his bag and limped down the aisle without a word. The toddler smiled at him as he passed. He smiled back, soft and resigned. Seat 32B was exactly what he expected. Cramped, confined, wedged between a college kid lost in headphones and a businessman too busy for eye contact. The overhead light was broken. The air stank faintly of disinfectant and coffee. He lowered himself with great effort, pain flaring as his knee bent farther than it had in years. He rested his hands in his lap, closed his eyes, and exhaled. No one noticed. No one offered help. No one said a word. But someone was watching. 3 rows ahead, across the aisle, a woman in a navy blazer sat still, her eyes fixed on him. Her name was Charlotte Hayes. And she wasn't about to forget what she just saw. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank sat motionless in seat 32B, his back pressed stiffly against the rigid frame, his knee already pulsing with a steady, hot ache that crawled up his thigh like wildfire. He kept his eyes closed, not because he was tired, but because it was easier than facing the eyes he could feel lingering on him. The middle seat was everything he remembered from the flights he used to dread. Tight, claustrophobic, indifferent. To his right, the young man in a college hoodie had earbuds in, head bobbing slightly to whatever bass-heavy song played in his ears. To his left, the businessman in a tailored jacket clacked furiously on a laptop, elbow already drifting into Frank's space like the man had declared dominion over the shared armrest. No one looked at him. No one said a word. He shifted slightly, trying to ease the tension in his leg. A sharp jolt shot through his knee. He bit down on the pain, his jaw tightening as he gripped his thigh with both hands beneath the small tray table. He'd been through worse. So much worse. But something about this, a commercial plane, a forgettable seat, a forced concession to someone else's convenience, gnawed at him in a way that surprised even himself. He wasn't angry. No, not quite. But he was tired. Tired in a way that didn't come from age. Tired of being unseen. 3 rows up, Charlotte Hayes was still watching. She hadn't opened her laptop. It sat untouched on the tray table, her manicured hands folded over it. She'd seen the whole interaction. The way the flight attendant's voice shifted into forced diplomacy, the way the older man, this man now hunched in pain, had tried to explain without raising his voice. He hadn't argued. He hadn't shouted. He had simply tried to be heard. And still, it hadn't mattered. Charlotte had spent most of her career crafting the public image of executives and airlines, navigating spin and PR fallout like a practiced swimmer in stormy seas. She'd learned early that stories like Frank's never made it to the front page. Not unless someone demanded they did. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly. She opened her private work app, typed a message to a colleague in customer relations. Her thumbs danced over the screen with surgical precision. Passenger Frank Delaney. Forced to give up confirmed aisle seat 14C due to family relocation. Documented medical need. Now placed in 32B. Crew dismissive. Please escalate before departure. Flight 306. She hit send and stared at the message for a second, then tucked her phone away. She didn't know what would come of it. But some things were worth trying for. Some people were worth seeing. Especially those who had spent decades being overlooked. Back in seat 32B, Frank tried not to move. The pressure on his knee was constant, but movement made it worse. His hands rested on his lap, knuckles calloused and worn, one finger bent at an unnatural angle, an old break from a firefight in the hills outside Key San, one of many injuries that never quite healed. They had treated him in the field, stitched him up, sent him back out. That was the way it had been. There was no complaint. There wasn't time for it. But now, decades later, every bump, every press, every compression in a space too tight to stretch served as a quiet, cruel reminder of what he had given up. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, conducting final checks. One passed Frank without a glance, simply tugged the overhead bin above him and kept walking. There was no apology. No acknowledgement. Just protocol. Frank didn't expect much anymore. That was the truth of it. Life had taught him not to. From the cockpit, Captain David Miller reviewed the final pre-flight checklist, his voice calm and precise as he responded to his co-pilot's confirmations. He'd flown thousands of hours, through rough weather, mechanical failures, and high-stakes international routes. He liked order. Clarity. He respected the chain of command. But when the red notification pinged across his console, labeled, passenger disruption, internal flag, his fingers paused. He tapped the screen, scanning the message forwarded from corporate relations. Passenger Frank Delaney, retired USMC. Seat change conflict. Medical accommodation disregarded. Now in 32B. Submitted by Charlotte Hayes. His brows lifted. The name Delaney stirred something in him. He had seen it before, years ago, in a training module honoring decorated servicemen, used as an example of courage under fire. Frank Delaney, Staff Sergeant, Marine Corps, 1968. David tapped deeper into the system, pulled up the full profile. He stared for a second at the sparse note. Combat injury. Key San. Multiple commendations. Then at the line, relocated under pressure to accommodate family seating. He exhaled sharply and looked at his co-pilot. Hold taxi, he said. Captain. Hold position. I'll be back in 3 minutes. David unbuckled his harness and stood, straightening the gold stripes on his cuffs, smoothing his pressed Navy uniform. Then he stepped into the corridor behind the cockpit and gestured to the lead flight attendant. She approached with curiosity, unsure. Where is the passenger from 14C? He's in 32B, sir. We had to move him. David held up a hand. Thank you. That's all. The cabin door opened. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Phones lowered. Charlotte's eyes widened as she saw the captain walking slowly, purposefully down the aisle. Something in the air shifted. People straightened in their seats. The cabin fell silent, not out of fear, but anticipation. Frank sensed the presence before he saw it. A shadow moved across the row. He opened his eyes and looked up. The pilot was standing before him, tall and composed, eyes clear and unwavering. Then, in front of a stunned cabin, Captain David Miller raised his right hand and gave Frank Delaney a crisp, formal salute. Everything stopped. For one breathless moment, there was no plane, no rows of plastic seats, no intercom buzz. There was only a man who had once served and another who refused to let that be forgotten. Frank blinked, confused. His mouth opened slightly, words caught somewhere between surprise and emotion. "Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney," the captain said, his voice steady, resonating with quiet authority, "on behalf of Transcontinental Airlines, and as a fellow serviceman, I offer you my deepest apologies. You should not have been asked to give up your seat." The words hung in the air like a flag unfurling. And then everything began to change. Frank Delaney had sat in silence for a long time before the captain appeared. When the young attendant forced him to abandon his aisle seat, he told himself to breathe through the pain, to be patient, to endure as he always had. Seat 32B wasn't just cramped, it was a box that pressed his body into itself like a punishment. It wasn't about pride. It was about dignity. A man who had once crawled through jungle mud with shrapnel in his leg shouldn't have to beg for room to stretch it. Yet here he was, wedged between two men who didn't care to look his way, with no space to extend his leg, no room to lean, and no relief from the grinding ache that pulsed through his body like a second heartbeat. The college kid to his right slouched with his headphones in, eyes half closed, mouth twitching slightly to whatever music beat through his ears. The man on his left typed furiously on a laptop, his elbow poking into Frank's side as if Frank's presence was simply an inconvenience. They didn't say hello. They didn't ask him if he was okay. They just occupied their own bubbles, blind to the man trapped between them. Frank didn't blame them. The world had grown used to looking away. He'd seen it happen more times than he could count, veterans asked to step aside, elders treated like burdens, dignity chipped away not by war but by indifference. He tried not to move, knowing even the slightest shift sent fresh waves of fire through his leg. He braced himself with both hands, clenching the muscle around the old injury to keep it from locking up. Sweat formed at the edge of his brow. He had learned long ago not to complain, even when it hurt like hell. Pain was part of the deal. But the silence, that was something else. There was no respect in silence. No humanity. Just the hollow space between two strangers, a void where someone once said thank you but now said nothing at all. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was remembering that seat 14C had been his chance at peace. His chance to get to Annapolis and watch his granddaughter march across the parade ground in her dress whites without limping down the terminal like a broken man. Her name was Jasmine. She had called him every Sunday from the academy. She'd told him about her classes, her physical training, her dreams of becoming a naval aviator. She'd asked him once if he'd be proud. Frank had chuckled. "I already am," he'd said. And he meant it. She was the future, and he had done his part in the past. But now, the idea of showing up limping, hunched over in pain, made him feel like he was failing her. He didn't want her to remember him like this. Charlotte Hayes watched from row 29. She hadn't looked away since the captain had saluted. She couldn't. Something about the sight of that man trapped in a space too small for his presence had ignited something in her chest. She had built her life around solving crises, but this wasn't a crisis. It was a quiet injustice, the kind that rarely got fixed because no one ever spoke up. And yet, she had. And now the pilot was walking back toward the cockpit, and she could see the look in his eyes. Determined. Focused. Righteous. Frank hadn't known what to say when the captain saluted him. No one had done that in years. Not sincerely. It wasn't the gesture that stunned him. It was the weight behind it. The recognition. For so long, he had moved through life as if the world had forgotten he ever served. The VA appointments. The faded medals. The slow walks to the mailbox. People thanked him on Veterans Day, sure, but few meant it. This felt different. This came from someone who understood the cost. But the moment had passed, and Frank was still stuck in the middle seat. The captain had spoken kind words, but the seat assignment hadn't changed. He felt the discomfort returning, the tightness across his chest, the panic that threatened to break through years of restraint. He shifted again, and this time the businessman huffed and shifted away slightly as if Frank's discomfort was contagious. The intercom clicked. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the voice of Captain David Miller, clear and unshaken, "before we complete our pre-flight procedures, I want to take a moment to address something that occurred on this aircraft." Frank's heart thudded. All around him, passengers looked up. The businessman paused his typing. The kid took out one earbud. "Today," the captain continued, "a veteran of the United States Marine Corps, Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney, was asked to surrender a medically necessary seat in order to accommodate a family seating request. This request was handled without proper consideration of his service or his condition. That was a failure. It was a failure not only of policy but of respect." A hush swept through the cabin. Every pair of eyes was now locked on the speakers overhead. "Let me be clear," the captain said, "this airline may carry passengers, but we do not carry passengers at the cost of dignity. And we do not, under any circumstances, allow those who've carried this nation through its darkest hours to be treated as an afterthought. That stops now." Frank felt his throat tighten. He hadn't asked for a speech. He hadn't wanted attention. But the word struck something deep, a place in him that had long gone silent. Effective immediately, the captain continued, "Mr. Delaney will be escorted to seat 1A, first class. If that seat is occupied, we will ask for a volunteer. If none is found, I will relinquish my own seat. Because we do not leave our own behind. Not in combat, not in a cabin, not at 30,000 feet." Charlotte sat back, her eyes misting. She wasn't the only one. All around the cabin, heads nodded. Someone clapped once. Another joined. The ripple spread like a quiet wave. Frank blinked down at his hands. Then, for the first time since boarding, he looked up, truly looked around, and saw eyes meeting his. Not judging. Not dismissing. Seeing. The flight attendant returned, her tablet forgotten in one hand, her face pale. "Mr. Delaney," she said softly, "please follow me." Frank hesitated, but the pain in his leg had become unbearable. Slowly, with effort, he stood. The businessman rose to let him pass, awkward and sheepish. The college student offered a quiet, "Sir." And Frank, without saying a word, made his way down the aisle. As he walked, passengers leaned back to let him through. A middle-aged man touched his chest in silent salute. A young woman whispered, "Thank you." Frank didn't respond. His back was straighter now. His step steadier. And as he passed Charlotte, she met his gaze. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Because for the first time in a long time, Frank Delaney wasn't invisible. He was home. Even if only for a moment. Charlotte Hayes had spent the better part of 15 years learning how to stay silent in boardrooms full of men who mistook her quiet for agreement. She had mastered the art of restraint, of letting the weight of a look or the edge of a well-timed sentence do the work of a speech. But today, sitting in seat 29A, watching Frank Delaney limp back toward his new seat at the front of the plane, she realized that silence didn't always protect the right people. Sometimes silence just let the wrong things keep happening. When the pilot had emerged from the cockpit and saluted Frank, Charlotte had felt something shift, not just in the cabin, but inside her. She had never served, had no family in the military, no personal connection to the old man in seat 32B. But she had watched him walk down the aisle earlier with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had spent a lifetime earning every step. She had heard the weight in his voice when he said, "Staff Sergeant," and saw the way his jaw tightened when he gave up his seat without a fight. That quiet dignity, that invisible armor, had done something to her. She had acted on instinct when she sent the message. Now, she watched it all unfold. As Frank reached the front of the cabin, the curtain to first class parted, and the flight attendant motioned to seat 1A. There was already a man sitting there, a clean-cut guy in a pressed polo shirt sipping sparkling water. He turned, eyebrows raised, as the attendant leaned down to speak. Charlotte couldn't hear the words, but she saw the shift in the man's face, the moment confusion gave way to understanding. Then, without hesitation, he stood and stepped into the aisle, gesturing toward the seat with a nod. No protest. No questions. Just a quiet, "Sir, it's an honor." Frank gave a small nod in return. He didn't speak. He looked down at the floor, then back at the seat as if still unsure whether he belonged there. The captain stood to the side, his hand lightly under Frank's elbow as he steadied him into the wide leather chair. For a man used to being overlooked, the sudden attention was disorienting. The seat was soft, angled, a far cry from the rigid discomfort of 32B. But it wasn't the leather or the space that made Frank exhale for the first time in an hour. It was the silence. Not the empty kind, but the kind filled with reverence. As the attendant brought Frank a bottle of water and a blanket, Charlotte turned her attention to the rest of the plane. Something had changed. She saw it in the way passengers sat a little straighter, glanced toward the front with a new kind of stillness. She heard it in the hush that had replaced the boarding chatter. A man who had been invisible had just become the center of gravity in a pressurized cabin 30 rows deep. And no one seemed to want to look away. Charlotte reached for her phone again, not to record, not to post, but to open a blank note. Her fingers hovered for a moment, then began typing what she'd witnessed, just in case it never made the news. She wrote about the seat change, about the salute, about the weight of silence and how one act of dignity had unraveled it. She didn't write it as a professional or a strategist. She wrote it as a human being. Behind her, passengers began murmuring, hushed voices threading through the cabin like wind through tall grass. One man leaned across the aisle to whisper something to his wife. A young woman dabbed her eyes with the edge of her sweater. And across the way, Charlotte saw something she hadn't expected. A young man in jeans and a hoodie, his shaved head bowed slightly, stood slowly from his seat near the bulkhead. He looked unsure, nervous, as if he wasn't supposed to be standing. But then he took a breath, stepped into the aisle, and spoke. "Staff Sergeant Delaney," he said, loud enough for the first few rows to hear. Frank looked up, eyes narrowing. "I served under you," the young man said, voice catching. "Camp Leatherneck. 2006. Frank's expression changed. He stared hard at the man, searching his face, memory turning like gears in his mind. Then, slowly, his eyes softened. "Corporal Reeves?" he asked, voice just above a whisper. The man nodded, blinking quickly. "You saved my life. We never got to thank you." He tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he stood at attention, chest rising and falling, emotion playing on his face. Then he sat back down, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Frank turned away, his jaw tight, but his hands trembled slightly on the armrests. The silence in the cabin swelled again, not heavy but holy. The kind of silence that wraps around a moment and says, "Remember this." Charlotte had goosebumps on her arms. She glanced around at the other passengers, many of them stunned into reverence. Not for a celebrity. Not for a viral video. But for a man whose worth had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with sacrifice. Back at the cockpit, Captain Miller took a moment before stepping into the intercom alcove. He adjusted the mic and clicked it on. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we depart, I want to say a few words." Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. Today, a mistake was made. A man who served this country with honor, who carries the visible and invisible scars of that service, was asked to give up his seat, not due to airline error, but because of a policy that placed convenience over character. Frank stared at the captain, eyes wide. "I want to be clear," the captain continued. "We will not take off while injustice sits quietly in our cabin." The words struck like lightning. The air seemed to still. Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney is a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. He fought in Khe Sanh, Vietnam. He wore the uniform longer than many of us have been alive. He didn't ask for special treatment. He simply asked to keep the seat he booked so his leg wouldn't lock up from an injury he sustained in the line of duty. He paused. The silence deepened. We failed him. But we do not leave our own behind, not in combat, and not at 30,000 feet. And if correcting this means our flight is 10 minutes late, then I will carry every one of those minutes with pride. There was a beat. Then, from the middle of the cabin, a slow clap. Then another. And another. Until the plane, from back to front, rose into soft, sustained applause. Charlotte didn't clap at first. She just sat still, blinking back the sting behind her eyes. Then she lifted her hands and joined the others, knowing she was part of something bigger than a flight delay. Frank didn't smile. He didn't bow his head. He simply sat there, hands folded, finally seen. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the silence working in his favor. Captain David Miller stood silently in the narrow cockpit hallway after his announcement, listening to the fading applause ripple across the cabin. He hadn't planned to speak. In fact, he almost hadn't acted at all. But something in that report from customer relations, something in that name, had struck like a match on dry wood. Frank Delaney. Staff Sergeant. USMC. It wasn't just a generic name in a passenger manifest. It was a name from a story he had carried with him for years. A name that had shaped part of his own sense of duty long before he ever wore a pilot's uniform. David returned to his seat in the cockpit, settled back in, but didn't buckle just yet. His co-pilot, a younger man named Adam, turned toward him with a quiet stare. "I've never seen a cabin go that still," Adam said, his voice hushed even in the insulated cockpit. David didn't respond right away. He reached into the side compartment beside his chair and pulled out a weathered black folder. Most pilots had it, a file of personal checklists, weather patterns, old notes. But tucked inside David's was a single laminated card he had kept since flight school. It was an excerpt from a Marine after-action report, used once during a leadership seminar he'd attended at Quantico as part of a joint military-civilian course. The story had stayed with him ever since. It was dated February 1968. Khe Sanh. An ambush on a supply convoy. A staff sergeant named Frank Delaney had pulled 6 wounded Marines out of a burning vehicle under enemy fire. One leg already shattered by shrapnel, he had crawled across open terrain, dragging the last man by his flak vest. The report said the evac was above and beyond, but the commendation had been delayed, then buried. War was messy. Bureaucracy even more so. And men like Frank? They got lost in the files unless someone made it their job to remember. David ran his fingers over the card. He hadn't read it in years, but now he could recall every line. He hadn't known Delaney was alive. And certainly not that he'd one day end up on his flight, being asked to surrender a seat he'd paid extra for just to ease the pain of the very injury that had come from that same field of fire. The idea made David's gut twist. He thought about his own years in the Air Force. Not as long, not as bloody, but still marked by the kind of memories that never fully faded. He thought about the men he'd flown home, the ones who didn't talk during the entire flight, just sat with silent eyes and heavy packs. He thought about the folded flags he had helped deliver. And then he thought about how easy it was, even in a country that claimed to honor its veterans, to forget what that honor actually meant. Frank Delaney hadn't asked for anything. That was what struck David the most. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene. He had simply said he couldn't move because of his knee, then moved anyway when pressured. That kind of quiet strength, that was the real weight of service. And it had been ignored. David buckled his harness, clicked through the remaining checklists, but his mind remained on Frank. He wondered what kind of life the man had led after the war. Where he lived. If his family knew the full story. If they even understood what he'd been through. It was a thought that made David clench the armrest slightly. Because too many times, the men who had given everything walked among the rest of the world unnoticed, until someone asked them to move out of the way. "Ready for taxi?" Adam asked. "Yeah," David said. "Let's do it." They pushed back from the gate, the plane slowly rolling down the tarmac. The rest of the flight was routine, but there was a different energy in the air. The flight attendants moved with more intention. Passengers spoke in quieter tones. Every so often, someone would glance toward seat 1A with something close to reverence. Not fame. Not awe. Respect. Frank sat upright, his hands resting on the wide leather armrests like they were foreign objects. He hadn't sat in first class in his entire life. He could still feel the echo of the captain's words in his chest, still see the eyes of the man who had stood and told him, without fanfare, that the seat was his. He wasn't used to being seen, much less celebrated. He didn't know what to do with it. A flight attendant came by again, this time gentler. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Delaney?" Frank looked at her. She was younger than Kayla, maybe mid-20s, with a nervous kindness behind her professional smile. "I'm good," he said, his voice quiet. "Thank you." She lingered a second. "I just wanted to say, my grandfather served too. He would have been proud." Frank nodded. The words caught in his throat, so he just smiled faintly and turned to look out the window. The sky beyond was painted in soft layers of blue and gold, the kind of light that only came when the day was slipping toward dusk. He hadn't expected any of this. He had just wanted to get to Annapolis, sit in the crowd, and watch Jasmine become the next in the family to wear the uniform. Now, he wondered what she would think when she heard. He didn't know that someone had taken a photo during the salute. That it was already circulating online. That the story had reached the inbox of the airline's CEO. All he knew was that, for the first time in a very long time, his name meant something again. The voice over the intercom came on. It wasn't the captain. It was the young man from earlier, Corporal Reeves. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "If it's all right with the captain," he said, "I'd like to say something." The intercom remained quiet for a moment. Then the captain's voice came back. "Go ahead, Corporal." "This man," Reeves said, "he doesn't know it, but I was in a convoy that got hit hard. I froze. I thought I was done. And then someone grabbed me, dragged me back. I didn't even know his name until now. Staff Sergeant Delaney saved my life. And I just want to say, thank you. In front of everyone. I'm here because of you." Frank lowered his head. He didn't move. But his hand reached up and touched the edge of his temple. A soft, silent salute in return. In the cockpit, David Miller turned off the intercom. He looked out at the runway ahead and whispered to himself, "Welcome home, Staff Sergeant." Finally. The plane rolled slowly along the taxiway, engines humming at a steady idle. Though cleared for takeoff, Flight 306 had not yet turned toward the runway. Inside the cockpit, Captain David Miller remained silent for a long moment, eyes fixed on the illuminated controls, his thoughts miles from procedures and flight paths. The sky ahead was streaked with golden light, the kind of sunset pilots quietly admire, but today it felt different. Today it felt earned. He glanced over at his co-pilot, Adam, who was watching him with a look of cautious curiosity. "You good to go, Captain?" Adam asked gently, his finger hovering above the last confirmation switch. David gave a small nod but didn't immediately answer. He was thinking not just of the man in seat 1A, but of the many like him who'd sat in silence for years, bearing wounds both seen and unseen. He thought of his own father, a Vietnam veteran too, who rarely spoke about the war but whose hands always trembled when folding a flag. The name Frank Delaney had brought all of that back. David had read the action report years ago during a leadership workshop, just one paragraph among thousands of others. But something about the way that report ended had etched itself in his memory. Unknown if recommendation for commendation processed. Subject continued duty under limited mobility. No further record. That was the last line. No medal. No parade. No closure. Just a man who kept going. I just needed a moment, David finally said. This flight turned into something more than a route on a schedule. Adam didn't push. He simply sat back, understanding more than he let on. Some flights carried cargo. Others carried history. In the cabin, the passengers remained quiet, as if aware that what had just happened deserved reflection. Even the children were hushed, their parents whispering softly into their ears. The flight attendants stood still near the galley, their routines paused by a sense that something sacred had unfolded in the middle of their workday. Charlotte Hayes sat with her hands clasped loosely in her lap, her gaze unfocused as she stared at the back of the seat in front of her. She had seen many powerful moments in her career, press conferences, national events, even presidential visits, but none had struck her like this. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. Real. An old man forced to move, then lifted back into visibility by the simple act of someone saying no more. She pulled out her phone and opened her notes again, continuing to type, not with the urgency of a reporter, but with the tenderness of someone who had just witnessed dignity restored. She described the captain's voice. The silence in the cabin. The tears in Corporal Reeves' eyes. And the way Frank Delaney had sat there, not craving attention, but bearing it with a grace that commanded respect. In seat 1A, Frank leaned slightly toward the window, his leg finally stretched out and no longer clenched in a knot of pain. The relief was physical, but something deeper had started to stir. He was still trying to understand why the captain had remembered him. Why that name, long forgotten by the system, had meant enough to halt an entire aircraft. The words spoken over the intercom had sunk in slowly, like rain on dry earth. He thought about the young man who had spoken, Corporal Reeves. The boy had grown older now, but Frank still remembered the chaos of that day, the explosion, the burning metal, the shouting. He remembered the heat and the blood and the way he hadn't thought, only moved. He had never expected thanks. He had certainly never expected it here, thousands of feet above the ground, decades later. He closed his eyes, listening to the low thrum of the engines and the soft murmur of the passengers. His hands rested on the armrests, and though he didn't move, his fingers tapped lightly, a rhythm without a song, but full of meaning. When the flight attendant returned, she knelt beside him and whispered, "Would you like anything, Staff Sergeant? Coffee? Tea?" Frank opened his eyes and smiled faintly. "Water's fine. Thank you." She hesitated, then added quietly, "My father served in Desert Storm. He never talks about it. But I think he would have liked you." Frank gave her a nod. He didn't have the words for what he felt, so he gave her something simpler. "Tell him welcome home," he said. Back in the cockpit, the radio chirped. Transcontinental 306, cleared for takeoff, runway 31 right. David reached for the switch, then paused, glancing again at the laminated report tucked beside his seat. He clicked the mic. "Roger, cleared for takeoff," he said. But before moving the throttles, he leaned back and took a breath. He keyed the cabin intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "thank you for your patience. I know we've taken a bit longer than usual to get underway. But some things are worth slowing down for. We're now cleared for takeoff. Please remain seated, buckle your seatbelts, and take a moment to remember that sometimes the most extraordinary people are the quietest ones among us." The plane began to roll. Engines roaring softly at first, then with growing power as it accelerated down the runway. The ground blurred beneath them. Then, with the precision of years and the strength of steel, Flight 306 lifted into the air. Frank felt the rise, felt the pressure shift as the aircraft left the Earth behind. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel heavy. He felt seen. Not because of the seat he now occupied, but because someone had remembered his name. Because someone had said, "We don't leave our own behind." Not in war. Not in silence. Not even in coach. As the plane banked gently to the east, headed toward Annapolis and the future waiting there, Frank Delaney leaned back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, slept without the weight of being forgotten. When Flight 306 leveled off at cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed, and a hush settled over the passengers like a shared breath held just a moment longer than usual. Even the hum of the engine seemed gentler, as if the plane itself understood that something sacred had happened before takeoff. Captain David Miller had returned to the cockpit, but his voice still lingered in the minds of every person on board. "We don't leave our own behind." Those words hadn't been part of any airline script, but they struck deeper than any corporate slogan ever could. They had come from a place of truth, and that truth still reverberated quietly through the cabin, row by row. Frank Delaney remained seated in 1A, his tall frame finally given the space it deserved, his bad knee gently extended beneath the bulkhead. He had adjusted the seat slightly to ease the pressure, and the warmth of the soft leather against his back was a relief beyond comfort. Still, his body did not completely relax. His posture remained upright, his hands clasped in front of him like a man accustomed to being called to attention. He didn't know how to melt into softness, not anymore. After a lifetime of being rigid when the world demanded it, even peace felt like an adjustment. The voice of Corporal Reeves had echoed in his ears since the young man's announcement. Frank remembered the boy, not his face, not fully, but his fear. It was always the fear that stuck with him. In Camp Leatherneck, chaos could come from any direction. One moment you were walking to the chow hall, and the next you were pulling someone out of the rubble with your own ribs cracked from the blast. He didn't remember how many men he had helped. He never kept count. But when Reeves had stood and said, "You saved my life," something fragile inside Frank had shaken loose. He looked out the window, but all he could see was the darkening sky tinged with the faintest streak of orange. The clouds below looked soft, untouched, like the world he always wished he could return to but never quite found after the war. Above that blanket of cloud, he could pretend for a moment that the world was still whole, that men didn't get forgotten, that service always met with gratitude. Across the aisle, a woman in her 60s leaned forward slightly, catching Frank's attention. She gave him a gentle smile, and he nodded in return. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions. It was just a look of quiet respect, the kind you might give a pastor or a teacher or someone who'd built something with their hands that mattered. Frank had never cared for praise. But in that moment, he realized something strange. He didn't feel proud. He felt accepted. And that was rarer. Meanwhile, in row 29, Charlotte Hayes stared at her blank phone screen. Her fingers hovered over the keys, unsure where to start. She had never cried on a plane before. She wasn't one for public displays. But when the captain saluted Frank, her throat had tightened in a way she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just what he did, it was the way he did it, without needing to explain or seek approval. A simple gesture. A correction made without shame. She had spent her career in communications, but she knew in that moment that sometimes the clearest message wasn't spoken into a microphone or printed on a press release. Sometimes it was just the sound of one man standing up when it counted. She began typing, her words slow but steady. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a PR statement. It was a memory, still warm from the moment it was made. She wrote about the old man who gave up his seat without a fight. About the captain who paused a flight for justice. About the soldier who stood to say thank you. And the silence that followed, the kind that was louder than applause. When she finished, she saved the file and stared out the window, knowing this was a story people needed to hear. In the back of the plane, the young mother who had unknowingly taken Frank's seat was gently rocking her toddler to sleep. She hadn't seen what happened up front. She hadn't realized until a fellow passenger whispered to her. Her face was pale now, her expression distant. She looked down at her children, then toward the front of the plane, her eyes scanning for a glimpse of the man she had displaced. She didn't know what she would say to him when they landed, if anything, but the guilt settled heavily on her chest. It hadn't been her fault entirely, but that didn't make her feel less ashamed. There were layers to understanding dignity. And she had just uncovered a new one. Back up front, Frank finally spoke. "Captain," he said softly as David stepped briefly out of the cockpit again for a cabin check. David turned, instantly alert. "Yes, Staff Sergeant." Frank looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You didn't have to do that." David smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "You're right. I didn't have to. But I did. Because it was right." Frank chuckled once, a low sound from deep in his chest. "You sound like someone who's worn the boots." David gestured to the insignia pinned inside his jacket. "Air Force. 11 years active, 12 in the reserve. My father was a Marine. Korea and Vietnam." Frank's eyes narrowed with recognition. "So you understand?" David nodded. "I do. And more importantly, I remember." They didn't say anything else. There was no need. The understanding passed between them like a folded flag, silent, weighty, sacred. As David turned back toward the cockpit, Frank leaned his head against the seat and looked out the window again. The sky had darkened fully now, but the stars had begun to emerge, tiny lights scattered across the canvas. Frank studied them with a quiet awe. Each one looked like a memory, small, distant, but burning steady despite the distance. And somewhere in the silence, the echo of that salute still lived. It wasn't just the motion of a raised hand. It was the restoration of something he didn't know he'd lost. It was his name remembered. It was his sacrifice acknowledged. It was his return to being seen. As the flight continued eastward through the dusky sky, Frank Delaney sat quietly in seat 1A, his thoughts far removed from the hum of the engines and the soft clinks of beverage carts making their rounds. The memory of what had just taken place still clung to the air like the scent of rain after a long drought. A few rows back, passengers whispered among themselves, but none dared disturb the solemnity that hung around him. He wasn't royalty. He wasn't famous. But in the past hour, he had become something greater, visible. Validated. Valued. And though he never sought that spotlight, it had found him just the same. He sipped his water slowly, letting it settle his throat, parched more from emotion than thirst. The flight attendant came by again, this time without pretense or script. Her eyes held genuine warmth, not the polished courtesy of standard service. She offered him a warm meal, tucked in a tray with silver cutlery and a cloth napkin, something he hadn't expected. He thanked her with a nod and placed the tray gently across his lap. Every movement was deliberate. His hands, though weathered, handled the utensils with the discipline of a man who had learned long ago never to waste emotion, especially when pain sat waiting just beneath the surface. Back in economy, the atmosphere had shifted. Kayla Bennett, the flight attendant who had moved Frank earlier, stood frozen near the galley, her tablet held loosely in both hands. Her mind replayed the entire exchange from earlier. Her tone, her insistence, the way she had pressured the old man to move because of a policy she thought couldn't be challenged. Now, with each step she took through the cabin, she could feel the eyes of passengers brushing over her. Not with outrage or cruelty, but with something worse, quiet judgment. She was used to managing people. She wasn't used to being on the wrong side of a story. She made her way up the aisle slowly, toward first class, her steps heavy with the weight of correction. When she reached the curtain that separated the cabins, she paused, took a breath, and gently pulled it aside. Frank looked up as she approached. He didn't scowl. He didn't raise an eyebrow. He simply waited, like he had 1,000 times before, for someone to decide who they were going to be in that moment. "Mr. Delaney," Kayla began, her voice soft and low, "I wanted to apologize." Frank didn't speak. "I should have listened when you said your seat was medically necessary," she continued. "I was thinking about schedules and logistics. I wasn't thinking about people. And I'm sorry." Frank studied her, his eyes not sharp but tired. "Not from age. From experience. I've been in tighter spots," he said finally, his voice calm. "But people remember how you treat them when they're hurting. Not just when they're easy." Kayla swallowed and nodded slowly. "I know. And I promise I'll remember that from now on." Frank gave a small nod and turned his gaze back toward the window. The stars outside seemed a little closer now, or maybe it was just that, for the first time in years, someone had looked him in the eye and admitted they were wrong. Kayla turned and left quietly, the curtain falling back into place with a soft swish. As she walked down the aisle, a few passengers met her gaze. One woman offered a tight smile of encouragement. A man in business casual gave a short nod. Redemption, she realized, didn't come all at once. It came in steps. In acknowledgments. In showing up differently the next time. Back in 1A, Frank folded his tray table and leaned back slightly. The ache in his knee had dulled into something manageable. He thought of Jasmine, his granddaughter, and how proud she would be when she saw him standing at the Naval Academy gates. He'd promised her he'd be there, and he would be, upright and steady, no matter the pain. He didn't want her to see an old man in need of help. He wanted her to see the man who had once carried others on his back through fire and shrapnel. He wanted her to see that honor didn't disappear with age. It just got quieter. The man seated beside him, who had been watching quietly from the beginning, leaned over slightly. "Sir," he said, "I'm the one who gave up this seat. I didn't know who you were at first. But I want you to know, even if I hadn't found out, I still would have moved." Frank turned to him with a quiet curiosity. "Why's that?" he asked. The man smiled. "Because when someone's in pain and you can help, you help. That's what I learned from my father. He served too. Navy corpsman. Spoke about the Marines with nothing but respect." Frank's mouth lifted in a faint grin. "Good man, your father." "He was. And he would have liked to meet you." They shook hands without fanfare, just two strangers who understood something the world sometimes forgot. That respect wasn't a transaction. It was a choice. A way of life. The captain made another announcement from the cockpit, this time about turbulence expected over the Appalachians, but few were listening closely. They had already been shaken and stirred in a different way. The cabin had witnessed something powerful, and even those who didn't fully understand it knew they'd seen something rare. Charlotte Hayes typed a final line into her notes. She was already crafting the bones of a story, though she had no idea how far it would travel. But that didn't matter. Whether it was published or simply passed from one person to another, the story would live. And that was enough. As the plane flew through the night sky, Frank closed his eyes again. This time, not to retreat, but to rest. For the first time in years, he wasn't retreating into invisibility. He was simply drifting into peace. A peace earned the hard way. A peace no one had to grant him because he had claimed it the moment he stood, endured, and was finally seen. The lights in the cabin dimmed as the flight attendants completed their final rounds, checking seat belts and gently reminding drowsy passengers to return their trays and recliners to upright positions. The sky outside was now a rich, infinite black, scattered with stars so sharp they seemed etched into the night. Somewhere over Kentucky, Flight 306 glided smooth and steady, but inside, an invisible pulse still ran through every row. The passengers were no longer strangers riding toward individual destinations. Something had woven them together, something deeper than coincidence. It was as if the air itself remembered what had happened, how the plane had paused, How a name had been spoken aloud, how a single man's story had shifted the balance of silence. Frank Delaney sat in 1A, his eyes half closed but mind alert, aware of every vibration under his seat, every slight dip in elevation. In combat, awareness had kept him alive, and even after all these years, that instinct still lived in his bones. He hadn't said much since the stewardess had returned his water bottle and apologized. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. Not by him, but by the captain, by the man who had given up a first-class seat, and by every gaze that met his with reverence instead of pity. He was just about to lean back again when a figure rose from the middle of the cabin. Frank didn't see him at first. He only noticed when the air shifted, when the murmurs ceased, and a hush rolled forward like a wave. "Excuse me," the voice said, trembling just above the ambient sound. It was a young man, maybe mid-30s, dressed in jeans and a faded gray hoodie. He had been sitting silently near the wing, unnoticed for most of the flight. But now, with his head held high and his hands clenched tightly by his sides, he walked forward into the open space near the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane. The flight attendant looked alarmed at first but then paused when she saw the emotion in his face. There was no aggression there, only something unspoken and urgent. The man's chest rose and fell quickly. His lips trembled. And then he turned to face the front of the plane, toward seat 1A. "Staff Sergeant Delaney," he said, and the name rang out in the quiet like a bell. Frank opened his eyes fully now, slowly turning his head. He didn't recognize the face immediately, but he could read something in the posture, in the voice, in the unmistakable weight behind the words. "I served under you," the man said. "Camp Leatherneck. 2006. A pin could have dropped and echoed like thunder. Frank's hands froze on the armrests. His eyes sharpened as he studied the man's face more closely now. A memory stirred, blurry but persistent. The desert, the heat, the chaos. A mortar attack that came without warning. One of the younger men pinned beneath a collapsed concrete beam, crying out for help. Frank had pulled him out by the straps of his vest while rounds cracked overhead. "Corporal Reeves," Frank said, the name emerging from somewhere deep inside. The man's shoulders shuddered. He nodded. "You saved my life. I never got to say thank you." Frank sat in stunned silence. His throat tightened. He had remembered the firefight. He had remembered dragging someone back to safety while the others provided cover. But he hadn't known the name. He hadn't known the face. Just the mission. Just the instinct. He had gone back into the smoke and the fire not for recognition but because that was what Marines did. "I've tried to find you before," Reeves continued. "But I only had part of your name. Everyone said you'd retired. Disappeared. I figured I'd never get to see you again." Frank still didn't speak. He didn't trust his voice yet. But something in his eyes flickered, not just recognition, but something softer. Something healing. "I didn't think I'd ever have the chance," Reeves said, stepping closer. "But when I heard your name earlier, when the captain said your name, I knew." He stopped there, his voice cracking. His eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and when he tried to say more, he faltered. Words abandoned him, as if they couldn't do the moment justice. And so he did the only thing he knew how. He raised his right hand in a slow, deliberate salute. It wasn't perfect. His elbow shook slightly. His hand quivered. But it was real. Frank stared at him. His heart pounded. His breathing shallowed. Then, almost involuntarily, his own hand rose, returned the salute, and the two men, separated by decades, by war, by silence, connected in that single, unbroken gesture. The passengers who had been watching said nothing. They didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They simply witnessed. Because some moments aren't meant for noise. They're meant to be held, like the sound of a folded flag against a chest or the breath of someone who just survived. Reeves lowered his hand slowly, his eyes shining now. "I just wanted you to know," he said quietly. "Because of you, I got to come home. I have a wife now. 2 kids. A little house in Ohio. None of that would have happened if you hadn't come back for me." Frank swallowed hard, his hand dropping back to his lap. His fingers clenched together. His voice, when it finally came, was rough and low. "I'm glad you made it home, son." Reeves nodded once, then turned, walking slowly back to his seat, each step less weighted than the last. And Frank, for the first time in a very long time, felt something shift in his chest. Not pain. Not grief. But release. As the cabin returned to its silence, it was not the same silence as before. It was deeper. Fuller. Alive. Frank leaned back into his seat, his gaze drifting again to the stars outside. And in their quiet glow, he found something he hadn't felt since the jungle, since the desert, since the moment he left the battlefield behind. He found peace. The cabin was still. Not a frozen kind of stillness, but the kind that followed a moment so full of meaning, no one wanted to disturb it. After Corporal Reeves had returned to his seat and Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney had returned his salute, something profound had settled over the passengers. Some were blinking back tears, others stared straight ahead, hands folded tight, as if clapping would somehow cheapen what they had just seen. In a world obsessed with noise, the silence on Flight 306 had become sacred. Captain David Miller watched from the cockpit door. He had stepped out quietly during Reeves's words, standing just far enough back to let the young man have his moment. But as the crowd fell back into its hush, David knew this moment wasn't finished. There was something left unsaid, something that belonged not just to the crew or the passengers, but to the memory of every man and woman who had ever slipped through the cracks after serving. He stepped forward into the cabin, adjusted his collar, and reached for the intercom. With a firm press of the button and a low click, his voice returned to the space that had already heard so much that day. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, and every eye turned forward again, "I want to take a moment to speak before we continue our flight." Even the children quieted. There was something about his voice, not just the uniform or the stripes on his sleeves, but the weight in his words that made people listen. Today, we witnessed something that many people go their entire lives without seeing. Not a confrontation. Not a problem. But an act of courage so quiet, so rooted in dignity, that most would have missed it had they not been paying attention. Frank shifted slightly in his seat, looking toward the front, his expression unreadable. Earlier today, a man who served this country with honor and distinction was asked to give up a seat he had paid extra for, a seat he chose because of the pain he still carries from his time in service. That man did not argue. He did not protest. He moved quietly, out of respect, out of humility, because that's who he is. Charlotte Hayes leaned forward slightly in her seat, eyes glassy, breath caught in her throat. But what followed, David continued, was a failure, not just of policy, but of awareness. And as captain of this flight, I take responsibility for correcting that. Frank's jaw clenched just a little, not in anger, but in surprise. He had not expected the captain to continue. He had not expected this moment to become something so large. This man, David said, Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney, is a decorated veteran of the United States Marine Corps. He fought at Khe Sanh in Vietnam. He dragged wounded Marines from a burning vehicle while his own leg bled from shrapnel. He served his country not just in combat, but in silence, in decades of carrying those memories while the world moved on. A murmur ran through the cabin, a kind of collective realization that the man in 1A had not just lived history, but had held it on his back and never complained. And today, the captain said, we almost allowed that history to be erased. But thanks to one passenger who noticed, and thanks to a crew that eventually understood, we didn't. And I say this now, for every person listening, young or old, military or civilian. We don't leave our own behind. Not in battle. Not in life. Not on a flight bound for Annapolis. He paused there, letting the word settle. No one moved. So if we land 10 minutes late today, David said, his voice steady, then I will carry every one of those minutes with pride. Because there is no schedule more important than remembering who we owe. And with that, he released the button. For a moment, there was nothing. No applause, no whispers. Then, from the back of the plane, one set of hands began to clap. Then another. Then another. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't rehearsed. But it was honest. A slow wave of appreciation moved from row to row until nearly every passenger on the aircraft was on their feet or leaning forward, clapping not just for the captain or the moment, but for the man in 1A who had become, without asking, the soul of this journey. Frank didn't rise. He didn't bow. He sat still, his head lowered slightly, hands folded in his lap. But his eyes shone with a light that hadn't been there when he first boarded. It wasn't pride. It wasn't relief. It was something deeper. Something that had lived inside him all these years, waiting for the world to remember. Charlotte closed her laptop and placed it gently into her bag. She had everything she needed. She didn't need to add polish or spin. The truth of the story had already been written, in actions, in salutes, in silence. As the applause slowly faded and passengers returned to their seats, Captain Miller nodded once toward Frank, then turned and disappeared into the cockpit once more. The flight resumed, smooth and uneventful, but nothing about it felt ordinary. Frank looked out the window again, this time not searching for anything. Just letting the stars speak for themselves. A seat, once taken from him, had become more than a seat. It had become a statement. And long after the wheels touched down, long after passengers collected their bags and walked out into the world again, this flight, this moment, this story would continue to fly. Not on jet fuel, but on something far more enduring. Honor. Frank sat still in his seat, his hands folded over his stomach, his eyes tracing the stars beyond the small window. The applause had died down minutes ago, but its echo remained inside him. It wasn't the sound of hands clapping that stayed with him, it was what they represented. All his life, people had looked past him. They had walked by him in stores. They had talked over him in waiting rooms. Even at the VA clinic, he was often just a number. But on this flight, without warning or expectation, the world had stopped. It had looked at him. And more than that, it had seen him. His mind drifted back to Khe Sanh, to the night everything changed. He could still feel the thick jungle air clinging to his skin, the sound of mortar fire cracking through the treetops, the screams echoing through the smoke. He had been a staff sergeant then, leading a patrol back to base when the ambush hit. The lead truck took the first blast. Flames lit the night sky like the sun had broken loose. The second vehicle stalled, bullets chewing through the windows before anyone inside could draw a breath. Frank had been in the third truck, shouting orders, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. He remembered leaping from the back, running into the fire with nothing but instinct and training keeping his feet moving. He had seen Corporal Sanders pinned beneath the twisted steel, his leg trapped under the axle. 2 others were down, Private Hughes with a head wound, and Lieutenant Ramirez clutching his shoulder, bleeding fast. Frank hadn't hesitated. He grabbed Ramirez first, hauling him to the tree line before sprinting back into the blaze. His knee took the shrapnel as he pulled Sanders free, the blast tearing through the dirt beside him. He remembered dragging Hughes with one hand, firing with the other. He remembered pain, but it was distant. It didn't matter then. Only they mattered. They all lived. And Frank never told anyone. He filed the report, accepted the pat on the back from his CO, and went on. No medal followed. No ceremony. The paperwork was lost in some drawer, shuffled away by an overwhelmed clerk, forgotten as the war ground on and the names on rosters changed like weather. Until now, he hadn't even thought it would ever be remembered. But now, sitting 30,000 feet in the air, surrounded by strangers who had heard his name and honored it, he felt something shift. It wasn't just pride. It wasn't relief. It was vindication. Not the kind that came with recognition, but the kind that settled deep in your bones, the sense that the pain you carried meant something. That it wasn't wasted. The young man in the seat beside him, Jacob, the one who had given up his seat, glanced over with admiration still swimming in his expression. "Sir," he said, "do you ever talk about it? What happened over there?" Frank looked at him, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Not much to talk about," he said. "It happened. We came home. That's more than some can say." Jacob nodded slowly. "My dad served in the Gulf. He used to say something like that too. But he carried it with him every day." Frank looked back out the window. "We all carry it. Some just don't let it show." He didn't want to talk more. Not yet. His body ached, not just from the long flight, but from years of holding it in. But as he sat there, the captain's words replayed in his mind. "We don't leave our own behind. Not in battle. Not at 30,000 feet. Those words were a bomb. They quieted something that had been restless inside him for years. Down in the cabin, Charlotte Hayes opened her email app and began writing a message to her editor. She wasn't a reporter, but she knew this story needed to be told. It wasn't just about a veteran. It was about the things that mattered in a world too busy to remember. Dignity. Honor. Sacrifice. She titled the draft, "The Salute at 32B." She didn't embellish. She wrote it plain and clear, the way it had happened. She described the moment Frank was asked to move, the hesitation in his eyes, the limp that told a story no one wanted to hear. She wrote about how silence fell when the captain stepped out of the cockpit, how the salute stopped time, how a whole cabin of strangers changed because one man decided that justice mattered more than the clock. She knew the story wouldn't just resonate. It would awaken something. Maybe it would remind people to look up. To pay attention. To ask questions. She thought of her own father, long gone now, who had fought in Korea and returned home to a factory job in a country that never quite said thank you. This story, she thought, would be for him too. In the last row of the plane, the young mother who had unknowingly taken Frank's seat held her sleeping toddler tighter. Her eyes hadn't left the aisle since the captain spoke. She hadn't known what she had caused. She just wanted to sit with her children. But now, with the full weight of it crashing over her, she felt ashamed. Not because she had asked. But because she hadn't looked. She hadn't noticed the limp, the way the old man had braced himself before standing. She had been so focused on her own needs, she hadn't seen his pain. And now, she wanted to do something, anything, to make it right. But she didn't know how. As the plane began its slow descent, the lights brightened. The flight attendants moved quietly through the cabin, collecting cups, checking buckles, their movements now a little gentler than before. Something had changed in them too. They walked slower. Smiled more sincerely. As if they were still trying to make up for the mistake. Frank sat up straighter as the altitude dropped. The change in pressure pressed gently on his ears, but he barely noticed. His mind was already in Annapolis. He could see Jasmine standing at attention, her cover tucked under her arm, her uniform pressed to perfection. He imagined her scanning the crowd, looking for him. He had promised her he would be there. And now, he was coming not just as her grandfather, but as someone who had finally been acknowledged for what he had carried all these years. He reached down and touched the edge of his duffel bag. Inside was a folded picture of Jasmine as a child, dressed in his old Marine cap, saluting with her left hand instead of her right. He had kept that photo for 20 years, long before she had decided to serve. He never told her what it meant to him. Maybe now he would. As the plane began its final approach, a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the cabin. It fell across Frank's hands, illuminating the scars and lines, every crease a story, every mark a memory. And for the first time in a long time, he felt whole. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The wheels kissed the tarmac with a gentle hum, the kind of landing that told passengers the captain not only knew what he was doing but cared about how it felt. Flight 306 had arrived in Annapolis just past noon, the sky above Maryland bright and clear, the kind of late spring day that smelled of beginnings. Passengers stirred as the plane taxied toward the gate, but there was no frantic fumbling for bags, no jostling elbows or tapping feet. They waited, as if still under the spell of what they had witnessed midair. Seat 1A remained still. Frank Delaney sat upright, his back firm, his hands folded gently on his lap. He didn't check his watch. He didn't reach for the call button. He simply waited, as he had done so many times before, with the patience of a man who understood that sometimes the most important things in life are worth being still for. When the plane came to a full stop and the seatbelt light chimed off, the crowd in the cabin slowly rose, a wave of movement cautious and quiet. Overhead bins creaked open. Soft conversation resumed. But something about the moment remained suspended, like a sacred breath still being held. As the rows began to empty from back to front, passengers turned their heads as they passed first class. They didn't stare, but they looked. They looked at Frank, not with curiosity, but with reverence. A few nodded. One older man whispered, "Semper Fi," as he passed. A young woman with tear-streaked cheeks touched her heart. A boy no older than 10 paused with his father, looking up at Frank like he was something out of a storybook, and Frank gave him a small, weary smile that made the boy stand a little straighter. Frank waited until the last passenger had moved past. The captain stepped out of the cockpit and stood at the entrance of the first-class cabin. "Mr. Delaney," he said, "we'd be honored to escort you off." Frank stood slowly, steadying himself with the armrest. His knee ached, but he didn't grimace. He lifted his duffel with care and looked the captain in the eye. "You already honored me, son," Frank said. "More than I expected. More than most ever did." Captain Miller didn't respond with words. He just nodded once, respectfully, then led the way down the narrow aisle. As Frank moved, flight attendants stood a little taller. Kayla was near the galley, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't speak, but her eyes followed him the entire way. At the threshold of the plane, the senior flight attendant stepped forward and offered her hand. "Thank you for your service," she said softly. Frank shook her hand, then stepped into the jet bridge. The light outside hit him instantly. Warm. Clean. Alive. His boots struck the ground with a steady rhythm, and for a moment, the echoes of combat, of desert winds, of steel bird landings in faraway places, faded into the present. He was here. He had arrived. Just beyond the security cordon near baggage claim, Jasmine Delaney stood in full dress whites, her cover under her arm, a hand-painted sign in her other hand that read in big letters, "Welcome Grandpa Frank." Her posture was perfect, spine straight, shoulders squared, but her eyes scanned every face with nervous anticipation. Then she saw him. Limping slightly, a duffel over his shoulder, expression stoic and familiar in a way that broke her right in half. She dropped the sign without thinking and ran. Frank saw her coming, the shape of her silhouette framed against the bright floor-to-ceiling windows. He didn't brace. He didn't prepare himself. He simply opened his arms and took the full force of her embrace. It hit him like a wave crashing against a seawall. Jasmine wrapped her arms around his chest and buried her face in his shoulder, sobbing without sound. Frank held her with both arms, the duffel falling to the floor, his face pressed gently against her cap. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, she pulled back, wiping her face and trying to collect herself. "Your knees," she said, eyes searching his face. "You shouldn't have stood so long. You look." "I've had worse," he said with a tired smile. Jasmine smiled back, and this time, the smile lit her whole face. It was the same smile she used to give him when she was 6, hiding behind the front porch after stealing cookies from the jar. They sat together on one of the nearby benches, letting the crowd pass them by. Jasmine had dozens of questions, but none of them rushed out. She just wanted to be near him. She told him about her graduation ceremony, about her posting, about how proud everyone in the family was. Frank listened. He asked about her ship. About her commanding officers. He wanted to know everything, and he wanted to listen like he used to listen to radios in the jungle, fully alert, heart first. But then Jasmine's phone vibrated. She looked down, her brow furrowing. "Grandpa," she said slowly, "I just got 5 messages from friends. And a link. Someone posted a video from the flight. Of the captain's speech. Of you." Frank blinked. "A video?" "Yeah," she said. "It's everywhere. Twitter. YouTube. News blogs. They're calling it, the salute at 32B. You're trending, Grandpa." Frank chuckled softly. "I don't know what that means, exactly." Jasmine's face softened. She showed him the clip, just a few minutes, blurry at times, but clear enough to see the captain's salute, to hear the reverent silence that followed. She watched his face as he watched the video, and when it ended, she saw something shift in his expression. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, but said nothing. Jasmine reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "You always told me to serve with honor," she whispered. "Today, I saw where I got that from." Frank looked at her hand in his, then at her face, and something long buried rose to the surface. Not a memory. Not a wound. Pride. Not in the applause. Not in the video. But in her. In this girl he had once carried on his shoulders through a 4th of July parade. In this woman who now carried forward everything he believed in. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a relic of the past. He felt like part of the future. The following morning, Frank sat at the small table in his hotel room, a fresh cup of black coffee steaming quietly beside him. The window blinds were cracked just enough to let the morning sunlight slip across the table, illuminating the envelope Jasmine had slid into his hand the night before. It was from the airline. Thick stock paper, carefully sealed, his name typed in bold letters across the front, Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney. He hadn't opened it yet. Something about it felt too formal, too heavy to rush through. He'd waited a long time to be seen, and now that the moment had arrived, he wanted to meet it fully awake. Jasmine had gone to her graduation rehearsal, promising to be back in a couple of hours. She had left him with a list of restaurants to try and a reminder not to leave without calling her. She was that kind of person, thorough, loyal, meticulous. Like a Marine, he thought with a quiet smile. Her spirit carried his blood, but her discipline, that came from something she'd built herself. Frank reached for the envelope and opened it slowly. Inside was a folded letter, printed on the airline's letterhead, and beneath that, a small card. He read the letter first, scanning each line with growing surprise. Dear Mr. Delaney. On behalf of Transcontinental Airlines, we offer our deepest and most sincere apologies for the events that occurred on Flight 306. No one who has served their country with the honor and sacrifice you have should ever be treated with anything less than full respect. While nothing can undo the discomfort and emotional weight of that experience, we hope to begin making it right. Effective immediately, you are designated a lifetime guest of honor on all transcontinental flights. No more booking codes, no more upgrade fees. Wherever you go, just tell us, and we'll take you there. First class, always. No questions asked. We salute your service. And we will not forget it again. TCA Veterans Council. Frank set the letter down slowly, his fingers resting on the card tucked behind it. It bore his name in raised gold letters and a small emblem of the airline's crest. At the bottom, embossed in elegant print, were the words, "Honor flies with you." He ran his thumb over them gently. He had never expected anything like this. Not now. Not ever. He reached for his phone, wanting to text Jasmine, but paused when he saw the notifications. Dozens of them. Emails. Voicemails. Messages from unknown numbers and names he hadn't seen in decades. Confused, he opened his inbox and scrolled. One message stood out immediately. The subject line read, "You don't know me, but I know who you are." He opened it slowly. The body of the email was brief, but as he read, something inside him stirred. "Sir. My name is Captain Ellis Hart. I served in Iraq, 2004. My father was Lieutenant Ramirez. You pulled him out of a burning convoy in Vietnam. He told that story every year on my birthday. He passed last winter, but I wanted you to know he never forgot you. Neither did I, seeing your name in the news. I just had to say thank you." Frank leaned back, swallowing hard. Ramirez. He remembered that name. Young. Brave. Shot through the shoulder but still shouting orders as Frank dragged him behind cover. That night had stayed with him, but he'd never known what became of the man afterward. And now, decades later, his son had found him. Because of a video. Because someone had watched. Because someone had cared. He opened the next message. Staff Sergeant Delaney. You probably don't remember me, but I was Corporal Mason, 3rd Platoon. You kept me from bleeding out in Fallujah. I was just a dumb kid, scared out of my mind. You kept me calm. You held my hand and said, "Just breathe, son. You're gonna see home again." You were right. I did. And now I have a daughter of my own. She wanted me to tell you something. Thank you for giving my daddy back to me. Frank sat silently for a long moment, eyes brimming but unblinking. He read every line. Every name. Every memory that had been returned to him like forgotten dog tags pulled from the dirt. Each message unearthed a piece of his life that he had long assumed the world had buried. His voicemail inbox was no different. One after another, voices spilled out in gratitude. A man in Georgia who had recognized him from a shared patrol. A nurse from a VA hospital who had once tended to him and never forgot his humility. Even strangers who had never met him, simply saying they had seen the story and were moved to tears. One message was from a schoolteacher in Montana. I played the video of your flight for my students today. 8th grade civics. We talked about dignity. About sacrifice. About what it means to do the right thing when nobody's watching. They all stood and saluted your photo at the end. Thought you should know. Frank pressed the phone to his chest and closed his eyes. He had never asked to be remembered. He had simply lived. Done his job. Protected his men. He had endured and gone home quietly, as most did. But now, all these years later, the noise he had once left behind was calling back, not to haunt, but to honor. The knock on the door came soft but clear. Frank stood and opened it. Jasmine stood there, still in her rehearsal uniform, her cap tucked under her arm, cheeks pink from the wind. She looked at him, eyes wide. You saw it, didn't you? She asked. I did, he said, his voice low. And the letters? He nodded. She stepped inside and pulled something from her bag. It was a printed-out photo, Frank, seated in 1A, his head slightly bowed, sunlight casting a golden beam across his weathered hands. The caption at the bottom read, Honor doesn't fade, it waits to be seen. It's being shared everywhere, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You're not invisible anymore, Grandpa. Frank looked at the image, then back at her. I was never invisible, he said softly. Just quiet. And now, the world had finally decided to listen. 2 weeks had passed since Flight 306 touched down in Annapolis, but for Frank Delaney, time no longer felt like a straight line. Each morning, he rose early out of habit, made his coffee, and sat by the window, expecting the usual stillness of retirement. But now, the silence held a different weight. It wasn't the quiet of being forgotten. It was the quiet of something waiting to arrive. And on the 14th morning since that flight, it came. He had just folded the newspaper when the knock came at the door. It was the kind of knock that didn't demand attention but carried authority nonetheless. He opened it to find a courier in a crisp navy blue uniform standing on his porch, a leather satchel in hand and a clipboard extended. "Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney?" the courier asked. Frank gave a slow nod. "Delivery from the Department of the Army, Office of Military Records. Requires signature." Frank's fingers tightened slightly on the pen as he signed his name. When the courier handed him the envelope, heavier than most, he felt the past settle into his hands like it had never left. He thanked the young man, closed the door, and stood still for a long moment in his narrow hallway, staring at the seal of the Department of the Army stamped cleanly in the top left corner. He sat down in his kitchen, laid the envelope carefully on the table, and opened it with a letter opener he hadn't used in years. Inside was a single-page typewritten note on official stationery, and beneath it, another envelope, this one smaller, hand-addressed in faded ink, with an unfamiliar but neat cursive signature. He read the formal letter first. "Dear Mr. Delaney. Following recent media circulation and a subsequent public inquiry, your personnel file has been reopened and reviewed by the Department of Military Records. In the process of this review, a long-overlooked action report dated February 1968 from the Khe Sanh combat zone was recovered. The report details a significant act of bravery performed under hostile fire which, due to clerical mishandling and incomplete documentation during wartime conditions, was never fully processed. We regret the delay in recognition. Enclosed you will find both the restored action report and a personal letter from an individual involved in the event in question. Your commendation has now been reclassified and submitted for formal acknowledgement. Respectfully. General James E. Lockhart. Office of Military Archives. United States Army." Frank didn't move at first. He read the letter again, then carefully set it aside. With hands no longer entirely steady, he reached for the second envelope. The paper was old, worn at the edges, as if it had been held and reheld by someone who had never forgotten. He opened it and unfolded a sheet of lined stationery, yellowed slightly with time. "Frank. I was Corporal Turber, number 3 in that vehicle. You probably don't remember me. I never got to say a word that day. I blacked out before you pulled me clear. The last thing I remember was the heat from the fire and your voice shouting to move. And then I was gone. But you brought me back. You brought all of us back. They told me later what you did. That your knee was already shattered. That you had blood running down your boot. That you went back in anyway. They said you dragged 6 of us out, that you didn't stop until everyone was safe. I didn't know what to say then. I still don't know now. I spent my life trying to live in a way that would honor that moment. I got married. Raised kids. Built a life. Because of you. When I saw the story about the flight, about the salute, the captain, the standing ovation, I knew it had to be you. I recognized your name, your eyes. I never forgot those eyes. I saw them once in smoke and fire. Now I see them in peace. You were never invisible. Not to us. General J. Lockhart. USMC, Ret. Frank read the letter in full, then again, then once more. He sat very still. His eyes burned, but he didn't blink. His heart beat slowly, as if absorbing the weight of every word. He remembered the name Lockhart, though only vaguely. A young corporal, barely 20, the third one trapped in the burning transport. He dragged him out last, when his own leg could barely bend, the bones screaming with every movement. The memory was hazy, overwhelmed by adrenaline and gunfire and heat. He had never asked who made it home. He had never known. But now he did. He folded the letter and placed it beside the official one. Then he stood, walked slowly to the glass cabinet at the back of the living room, and opened it. Inside were the few keepsakes he had kept from the war, his folded flag, a faded photo of his unit, his dog tags hanging from a nail. And now, gently, with both hands, he placed the letters beside them. A new edition. A correction, decades overdue. The phone rang then. It startled him, not because it rang, but because of who it was. Jasmine. She had never called this early. "Grandpa," she said, breathless. "Did you get something from the army today?" "I did," he said softly. "They just called the academy. You're being invited to a private recognition ceremony. They want to award you in front of the graduating class tomorrow morning. Full honors. Medal, citation, everything. The commandant himself will be there." Frank didn't speak. "Grandpa," she said. He cleared his throat. "That's not why I came." "I know," she said. "But it's why they're finally seeing." He closed his eyes for a moment, then smiled. "All right," he said. "I'll be there." As he hung up the phone, Frank looked around his quiet house. Everything was the same as it had always been. The furniture. The curtains. The soft tick of the old kitchen clock. But something in the air had changed. Something in him had changed. He had lived for so long without needing the world to notice. But now that it had, he realized something. It mattered. Not for ego. Not for pride. But because every man who ever served and never heard their name again after discharge deserved to know they were never lost. They were just waiting to be found. Frank walked to the porch with his coffee, the spring air crisp against his skin. The sun had fully risen now, casting light across his yard. He looked up into the blue sky, the same sky he'd flown beneath weeks ago, and smiled to himself. The world hadn't just remembered his name. It had remembered his story. In a quiet apartment tucked above a coffee shop in Richmond, Virginia, Charlotte Hayes sat cross-legged on her sofa, laptop balanced against her knees, eyes scanning the final paragraph of the story that had lived inside her for 2 weeks. The morning sun streamed through her windows, casting warm squares of light across the hardwood floor. A mug of cold coffee sat forgotten on the side table, long since abandoned in favor of the energy pulsing through her fingers. Her living room was cluttered with notes, open tabs, audio clips, and video stills, pieces of a moment that refused to fade. She had written hundreds of stories in her career, from crisis communications to political op-eds. She had shaped narratives, cleaned up disasters, helped people apologize and spin their way out of trouble. But this was different. This was something she hadn't touched with strategy or polish. She had simply told it the way it had unfolded. A man on a plane. A forgotten hero. A captain who stopped everything to honor him. And a cabin full of strangers who remembered what gratitude felt like. The headline at the top of her document glowed on the screen, "The salute that stopped the sky." She clicked save, attached the file to an email, and addressed it to her editor at the regional publication that had first asked her to freelance 10 years ago. They still reached out now and then for op-eds and commentary. But this piece, she knew, was something more. She didn't want payment. She didn't want a byline in bold. She just wanted it told. As she hovered over the send button, she hesitated. Not out of doubt, but reverence. She thought about Frank Delaney. About his quiet voice, his posture, the pain he had carried like a second skin. She remembered the way his hands had rested still in his lap, how he didn't rise when others clapped, how he didn't need to. She hit send. The moment the email disappeared into cyberspace, Charlotte exhaled deeply and leaned back against the couch cushions. She had done her part. The rest was up to the world. But she wasn't prepared for how fast that world would respond. By late afternoon, her editor had forwarded the piece to a national media syndicate. By midnight, it had been shared across 5 major news outlets. The story headlined a veteran spotlight on a primetime news program. Cable anchors read excerpts of her article aloud on air. The video clip of the in-flight salute surged past 5 million views, then 10. Hashtags bloomed across social platforms. Hashtag Frank Delaney, hashtag the salute flight, hashtag honor in the sky. And buried deep in the flood of reactions were stories. Thousands of them. Veterans commenting with memories of their own unrecognized moments. Families writing about grandfathers who never spoke of the war. Young people asking questions. Teachers printing the story for their classrooms. Principals reading it over loudspeakers during morning announcements. In schools, in churches, in town halls and social clubs, Frank's name had become a symbol of something long overdue. Charlotte watched it all unfold from her screen. She wasn't posting about it. She wasn't chasing credit. But she read every message that arrived in her inbox, especially the ones from veterans. Some short and clipped. Others rambling and raw. Every one of them personal. Every one of them mattered. Then, 3 days later, an email arrived from someone named Evelyn. It was simple. Unassuming. Dear Ms. Hayes. I'm writing from the office of the Commandant at the U.S. Naval Academy. We read your article and verified the incident involving Mr. Delaney. We are planning to honor him at the Academy's commissioning ceremony as a symbol of enduring service. We would like to invite you as a guest. Sincerely. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Ross. Charlotte read the message twice. Her eyes welled. She hadn't expected to be included. She didn't need to be. But something about that invitation felt like a full circle. The story had never been about her. But now, she was a thread woven into something much larger. She replied with a simple yes. When she arrived in Annapolis, the city pulsed with ceremony. Flags waved from every post. Midshipmen in spotless dress whites moved in coordinated rhythms. The Academy's grounds were alive with families, brass bands, and photographers capturing futures in motion. Charlotte made her way through security, past groups of laughing graduates and beaming parents, until she reached the special seating near the front of the stage. Frank Delaney was already there. He stood near the podium in his own pressed suit, a navy tie knotted carefully beneath his collar. He held his posture the way Marines always did, straight-backed, feet planted, shoulders square. He didn't need to speak. His presence was a declaration. Jasmine stood beside him in full uniform, glowing with pride, her eyes never far from his. Behind them, a crowd gathered, murmuring with curiosity. A few recognized Frank immediately. Others whispered as they were told. That's him. That's the man from the plane. As the ceremony began, Charlotte sat in silence, watching the stage. The Commandant gave his opening remarks, followed by speeches from decorated alumni and honored guests. Then came a pause. The air shifted. Before we commission the next generation of naval officers, the Commandant said, we pause to honor someone whose life reminds us that service does not end when the uniform is folded. He gestured toward Frank. Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney, United States Marine Corps, retired. You were forgotten by paperwork, but not by those you saved. You were overlooked by systems, but not by history. Today, we remember. Today, we recognize. And today, we honor you. Frank stepped forward slowly, the crowd rising to its feet in a wave of applause that swept the grounds. Some saluted. Some wept. Jasmine stood at attention, tears on her cheeks but chin held high. Charlotte wiped her eyes as she watched him receive his citation. There was no fanfare in his face, no ego. Only peace. And in that moment, as the American flag rippled in the breeze behind him, Charlotte Hayes believed something she had nearly forgotten. Stories matter. Especially the ones that make us remember who we were supposed to be. The sun rose gently over Annapolis, casting a golden glow across the Naval Academy's ceremonial field. Rows of white chairs had been arranged in precise symmetry, and a stage draped in red, white, and blue overlooked them like a sentinel. Flags flanked the perimeter, snapping softly in the morning breeze. Behind the stage, brass instruments gleamed under the early light, their players warming up with muted notes that hinted at what was to come. Today was a commissioning ceremony, but something about the air felt heavier, more reverent. This wasn't just another tradition, it was history correcting itself in front of an audience that would carry it forward. Frank Delaney stood in the green room behind the stage, adjusting the cuffs of his dark suit jacket. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from something deeper, an awareness that this moment was not his alone. He had worn a uniform most of his life, stood at attention more times than he could count, but today, he was being honored not for orders followed, but for a legacy lived. Jasmine entered the room with steady steps, her uniform crisp, her cover tucked beneath her arm. When Frank turned to her, their eyes met, and neither needed to say anything. She walked over and gently fixed his lapel, straightening the small silver Marine Corps emblem pinned near his heart. "They're ready," she said quietly. Frank nodded and drew in a breath, deep and slow. Together, they stepped out into the sun. The field was full now. Families, cadets, generals, reporters, even schoolchildren seated in rows off to the side. And at the very front, in the special seating section, sat Charlotte Hayes with a press pass clipped to her dress and a notepad in her lap. She had promised herself she wouldn't write during the event, but the gravity of the moment compelled her fingers to hold the pen anyway. She wasn't here to capture a story. She was here to witness it. The commandant stepped up to the microphone, his voice clear and grounded. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin the commissioning of our newest officers, we pause to honor a man whose story has reminded us what service truly means. Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney, United States Marine Corps, retired, embodies what we strive to instill in every cadet who walks these grounds. Courage without applause, loyalty without expectation, and a sense of duty that time cannot erase." Frank was called forward. The applause erupted with force, yet Frank walked calmly, his limp now softened by a cane that had been polished just for the occasion. The commandant handed him a framed certificate and then, after a short pause, reached behind the podium and held up a medal. This citation, the commandant continued, was due to be awarded 56 years ago but was lost in the bureaucratic noise of war. Today, it is presented posthumously to a younger version of the man before us, a 26-year-old Marine who ran into fire to save his brothers. But we give it now, not because the delay lessens its value, but because his integrity has only grown in the years since. The medal was placed around Frank's neck, and for a moment, he closed his eyes. The weight wasn't much, but its meaning pulled on something in his chest that had been buried for decades. When he opened his eyes, the field was standing. Even the cadets, rigid in formation, had turned to face him. Jasmine, just steps behind him, stood at attention. Her eyes glistened, but her spine was straight. Frank stepped toward the microphone. The applause faded into a hush. "I was a young man when I first wore the eagle, globe, and anchor," he began. "I didn't do it for medals. I did it because I believed in something bigger than me. I still do." His voice carried, even though he didn't raise it. "I didn't come here today for a ceremony. I came to see my granddaughter walk into a life of service. But if my story, if what happened on that flight, reminded you of someone you forgot, someone you served with, someone who never came home, then I'm grateful for that. Because those men and women deserve to be seen. Every single one of them." There was silence when he finished. Not because people didn't know how to respond, but because they were absorbing the truth of it. Then a slow clap began, one, then two, then the entire audience followed, not with thunderous noise but with unified rhythm. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was a salute in sound. When Frank stepped down, Jasmine met him at the bottom of the steps. She didn't speak. She simply took his arm. They walked back to their seats together, and as they did, a line of cadets broke formation. One by one, they stepped forward and saluted him. Not because they had to. Because they wanted to. Because they knew they were looking at someone who had lived the very oath they were about to take. Charlotte couldn't hold her tears back anymore. She let them fall silently as her pen moved again, not capturing quotes or composing a headline, but sketching a memory. A single phrase filled her page: "This is what it looks like when a country remembers." The ceremony continued, and Jasmine was eventually called forward with her unit. As she stood to take her oath, she looked back toward her grandfather. He didn't raise his hand in salute. He simply smiled and nodded. It was her moment now. When the last cadet crossed the stage and the band began the final anthem, the crowd stood one last time. But in that vast field, all eyes still returned to Frank Delaney. Not because he had demanded it. Because, without meaning to, he had reminded a nation of something it should never have forgotten. As the anthem swelled and the flags rippled in the breeze, Frank stood silently, cane in hand, the medal resting against his chest. Not for recognition. Not for pride. But for every man who never got their moment. And for every woman who would carry it forward. He didn't say a word. But that day, the country listened anyway. After the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Frank remained seated beneath the white tent, his cane resting against his knee, his gaze locked on the field that had just witnessed a kind of redemption he'd never dreamed possible. Around him, people lingered, snapping photos, hugging loved ones, exchanging congratulations. A few even approached him, cadets, parents, veterans, offering handshakes, salutes, and words of gratitude. But Frank remained quiet, letting their words wash over him like a tide he didn't need to control. He had always lived in the background, blending in, keeping his head down. Today, for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to be seen. Jasmine reappeared by his side, her uniform now adorned with her newly earned insignia. She looked taller somehow, not just because of the heels she wore, but because of the pride she carried. She leaned over and kissed her grandfather's cheek. "They want to take a photo of us for the Academy's annual," she said gently. Frank glanced toward the photographers waiting at the side of the tent. "Just us?" he asked. "No," she replied. "You, me, and every cadet who requested to stand in that photo with you. There's over 50 of them." Frank blinked, then gave her a crooked smile. "I suppose I should have shined my shoes a little better." She laughed and helped him to his feet. Together, they walked to the appointed area, where rows of newly commissioned officers had gathered around a chair placed specially for Frank. As he sat, they encircled him in formation, each one solemn, reverent. When the photographer called for smiles, many of them did. But Frank didn't. He just looked into the lens with the same unflinching calm he had carried through every battlefield in his life. The shutter clicked, and history caught its breath. After the photo, Frank stepped aside while the cadets returned to their families. That's when a young man approached him. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a blazer, and a simple baseball cap. He wasn't part of the ceremony. But something about the way he walked, the careful way he held himself, told Frank he had seen the inside of service too. "Mr. Delaney," the man said quietly, removing his cap. "My name's Marcus Green. I served in Kabul. I just wanted to shake your hand." Frank offered it without a word, and the two men stood there, hands clasped, a silent exchange only they could understand. "I read your story," Marcus said. "I saw the footage from the flight. My dad, he was in Vietnam. He never talked about it. He passed away last year, but I think if he were still around, he would have stood for you, too. Frank gave a slow nod. What was his name? Jerome Green. Specialist. 1969. Frank's face twitched, a thread of memory pulling at the corners of his mind. Camp Evans? Marcus's eyes widened. Yes. How did you know? I carried him to the evac chopper after an ambush. He had shrapnel in his thigh and kept trying to drag another wounded man with him. I had to knock him out to get him to let go. Marcus let out a stunned breath, then laughed softly. That sounds like something he'd do. I can't believe. You remember? I remember all of them, Frank said. Some names fade, but the faces stay. Marcus looked down, then met Frank's eyes again. I never got to say thank you. So, thank you. They parted with a final clasp, and Marcus faded back into the crowd. Jasmine returned to her grandfather with 2 water bottles in hand. She gave one to him, then glanced toward the direction Marcus had walked. Another one? She asked. Frank nodded. They keep finding me. Maybe it's not them finding you, she said. Maybe it's the world finally giving them a way to reach you. He looked at her, the young woman who had defended him on a plane, held his hand in a storm of humiliation, and now stood beside him as an officer. You know, he said, I never thought any of this would matter. The medals, the stories, the years. I figured I'd just disappear quietly like most of the men I served with. But you didn't, she said. Because you lived. Because you stood. And because someone finally told the truth. They sat for a moment longer, watching the field empty out. Then, as they prepared to leave, a small boy ran up to Frank, no more than 7 years old, with a piece of paper in his hand. His father trailed behind him, smiling apologetically. Hi, the boy said breathlessly. My teacher showed us your story in class. We had to write about a hero. I drew you. He handed Frank the paper, a crayon drawing of a man with dark skin, a cane, and a gold medal around his neck. Beneath it, in wobbly letters, were the words, My hero Mr. Frank D. He saved people and made a plane stop. Frank stared at the paper, something catching in his throat. He looked at the boy. You did a fine job, son. That looks just like me. The boy grinned proudly, then ran back to his father. Jasmine leaned over. I think you just made a fan for life. Frank tucked the drawing into his coat pocket and looked at her. I think I'm finally starting to understand. This was never about me. It was about them. The ones who come after. As they walked toward the exit, people continued to nod, salute, or stop and simply look at him. Not with pity. Not with curiosity. But with recognition. With respect. The man with the cane had become something far more than a passenger on a plane. He was now a symbol, not of fame or glory, but of quiet endurance, of dignity reclaimed, of what it meant to serve and never ask for anything in return. And as he reached the car, holding Jasmine's arm for balance, Frank looked back at the academy one last time. They had stood for him. But more importantly, he had stood for all of them. 3 days after the ceremony, Frank Delaney boarded another flight. This time it was a small regional jet heading from Baltimore to Atlanta, where Jasmine was stationed for her next round of officer training. She had insisted he visit, and though Frank had hesitated, the quiet tug of family was stronger than the weight of routine. The terminal was quieter than the last time he had flown, and no one stopped to ask questions or snap photos. That suited him just fine. Fame was a wave he had never tried to surf. He was content to stand in its wake. He stepped onto the aircraft slowly, cane tapping gently along the aisle. A flight attendant noticed and guided him toward his seat, 12A, a window seat near the wing. As he settled in, Frank looked out over the tarmac. Sunlight danced across the surface of the runway. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engines begin to cradle him in its rhythm. This time, there was no tension, no confrontation, no young woman demanding he move. This time, he had a ticket that matched his seat and a name that meant something to strangers. As passengers filed in, a young man in a business suit took the seat beside him, nodding politely. "Good morning, sir," he said. Frank gave a soft smile. "Morning." The man opened his laptop and began typing away. Frank turned back to the window, watching the workers below move luggage carts and refuel the plane. He didn't mind the silence. In fact, he had grown to appreciate it. The kind of silence that follows a long journey. Not emptiness, but peace. As the plane began taxiing, Frank reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out the crayon drawing the boy had given him at the academy. The paper was a little creased now, the corners worn from being handled too often, but the image remained bold, his cane, his medal, and the words "My hero Mr. Frank D." He smiled as he looked at it, then folded it gently and returned it to his pocket. When the flight took off, Frank felt the familiar tug in his chest, the slight drop in his stomach as the ground pulled away. He glanced at the clouds forming beneath them, a soft white blanket that stretched to the horizon. He had seen this view countless times before, on C-130s flying into combat zones, on troop transports heading home. But this one felt different. This one was for him. Halfway through the flight, the man beside him turned slightly. "Excuse me," he said. Were you the gentleman from that flight story? The one the pilot saluted?" Frank paused, then nodded. "That was me." The man's expression softened. "I read about you. I showed my dad. He's a veteran too. Said it was the first time in years he felt like somebody remembered." Frank's voice was low. "I'm glad it meant something." "It meant a lot," the man said. "My dad's been quiet since he left the service. Kept everything bottled up. But after reading about you, he finally told me what happened to his unit in '91. Said it felt like you gave him permission to speak again." Frank looked at the man with surprise. "Permission?" The man nodded. "Sometimes people carry silence like a shield. Takes someone brave enough to break theirs before others feel safe dropping theirs." Frank absorbed the words. He'd never thought of his story that way. Never imagined that being seen could give others the courage to be heard. The man turned back to his laptop, but not before adding, "Thank you for that." As the plane descended into Atlanta, Frank noticed something remarkable. He wasn't anxious about landing. He wasn't thinking about who might be watching or whether he'd be pushed aside. He was simply grateful. Grateful for a seat. For a clear sky. For the young man who recognized him not for fame, but for something deeper. For Jasmine, waiting at the gate in uniform. For every stranger who had reminded him that it wasn't too late to matter. When they touched down, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Atlanta. It's a beautiful day out there, 72 degrees and clear skies. On behalf of the crew, I'd like to thank you for flying with us. And I'd also like to extend a special thank you to a passenger in 12A, Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney. Your service, sir, has inspired more people than you'll ever know." There was a hush. Then a wave of applause, soft at first, then growing louder. Passengers turned in their seats, clapping not just politely, but with warmth. With knowing. Frank stayed seated, nodding in appreciation but not rising to claim the attention. He simply lifted his hand in a small wave and offered a quiet thank you to the faces turning toward him. As he exited the plane, the flight attendant smiled and whispered, "You're a legend on these flights now. We've all read the story. Welcome home, sir." Jasmine was waiting past security, standing tall with a wide smile and eyes full of light. She stepped forward and hugged him tightly, not caring who was watching. "You made it." "I always do," he said, chuckling softly. They walked toward the baggage claim together, the crowd parting slightly around them. Not because they demanded it, but because people felt it. Felt the presence of a man who had endured. A man who had served quietly, loved deeply, and now walked with a kind of peace earned by generations. Frank didn't need the window seat anymore. He had already seen the view. Now he was ready to walk the ground again, not as a forgotten passenger, but as a man whose journey had finally been seen, heard, and remembered. It was a quiet afternoon in Jasmine's apartment, a modest but clean space near the officer training compound. Sunlight filtered in through the blinds, casting warm, slatted shadows across the living room floor. Frank sat in an old armchair near the window, sipping tea from a ceramic mug that read, "Marine Grandpa," in faded blue paint. Jasmine was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared a late lunch, something simple, just grilled cheese and tomato soup, but it filled the apartment with a comfort that words couldn't replicate. The two of them had settled into a rhythm these past few days, the generational gap between them shrinking with every shared memory and every soft silence that required no filling. As Jasmine set the plates on the table, Frank reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, time-worn envelope. The corners were frayed, and the ink had begun to fade, but the seal remained unbroken. Jasmine noticed it immediately and raised her brows. "What's that?" she asked, sitting across from him. Frank looked down at the envelope, running his thumb over the name written in cursive. "Something I've carried for almost 60 years, he said. "It was given to me by a fellow Marine. Charlie McNeil. We were pinned down in Da Nang. He'd been hit and knew he wasn't going to make it. Told me to give this to his mother if I ever got out." Jasmine's eyes softened. "Did you?" Frank shook his head slowly. "I tried. I went to the address. But the house was gone. Neighbors said the family moved after the war started. No forwarding address. I didn't know where else to look, so I kept it. Figured I'd hold on to it until I found the right moment." "And now?" she asked. Frank took a long sip of tea. "Now I think maybe I was supposed to open it." Jasmine hesitated. "You never did. It didn't feel right. Wasn't meant for me. But after all that's happened, I don't know, maybe I was meant to read it. Maybe Charlie knew I'd be the only one to carry his last words." Jasmine nodded and leaned in slightly. "If you're ready, I think it's okay." Frank took a deep breath, then carefully peeled open the envelope. The paper inside was thin and brittle, but the handwriting remained clear. He unfolded it slowly and began to read aloud, his voice steady, even as emotion curled at the edges. "Dear Mama. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. I'm sorry for that. I know this isn't the ending you hoped for. But I want you to know I wasn't afraid. I was proud. I believed in why we were here, and I believed in the men who fought beside me. There's one man in particular I hope made it out. His name is Frank Delaney. If he did, and he finds you, I want you to know that he saved my life more than once. And in the end, he stayed with me. He didn't let me die alone. He told me stories about you, the way you used to braid my hair when I was little, the way you sang while cooking dinner. I want to thank you, Mama, for making me brave. You raised me to run toward the sound of trouble, not away from it. I want you to remember that I died believing in something bigger than myself. I died a Marine. Tell Tommy to keep looking after you. And tell Frank, if he's reading this, that I hope he found peace. He deserves it more than anyone I've ever known. Love, always. Charlie." By the time Frank finished, his hands were trembling. He folded the letter again, slower this time, as if it were a sacred object. Jasmine said nothing at first, just reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "He remembered you," she said softly. Frank nodded, eyes glistening. "And I remember him. Every day." There was a long silence. Then Jasmine stood and walked to a drawer in the kitchen. She returned with a small, leather-bound notebook and opened it to a blank page. "You should write it down," she said. "All of it. Everything you remember. For the ones who won't have anyone to tell their story." Frank hesitated, then took the notebook. His fingers traced the edge of the page. He thought of the stories locked inside him. Names, battles, laughter, fear, sacrifice. He had carried them like invisible medals, tucked away where no one could see. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to pass them on. That night, long after Jasmine had gone to bed, Frank sat by the window with a lamp casting a soft halo over the notebook's pages. He began to write. Not in paragraphs or chapters, but in memories. He wrote about Danaan. About Charlie and the letter and the firefight that changed everything. He wrote about the freezing nights in Korea, the desert sands of Iraq, the long hours of silence and the brief bursts of chaos. He wrote about the flight, the woman, the confrontation, the moment when the world paused and remembered. And he wrote about Jasmine, the granddaughter who had lifted him back into the light. He wrote until his hand cramped and the ink smeared. And when he finally closed the notebook, it felt like a chapter of his soul had been given new breath. Outside, the moon hung low, casting silver light across the city. Frank stared out at it, whispering a quiet promise to the night. They won't be forgotten. Not now. He returned the notebook to the desk, turned off the lamp, and walked toward his bed. As he lay down, cane resting against the nightstand, a deep peace settled over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from ceremonies or medals. It was the kind that came from being known, from telling the truth, and from knowing the story would live on. For the first time in decades, Frank Delaney slept without the weight of silence. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable flight, the commissioning ceremony, and the quiet days spent between Jasmine's apartment and Frank's old house in Maryland. The seasons had turned, the world kept moving, and yet the ripple that began in that narrow plain aisle continued to widen. Articles were written, letters arrived in bunches, and invitations came in from schools, veteran organizations, and even the Pentagon. Frank declined most of them. He wasn't chasing stages. But when the United States Marine Corps invited him to speak at the 248th birthday ball in Washington, D.C., and Jasmine looked at him with that mixture of admiration and challenge, he didn't say no. The ballroom at the Grand Hyatt was a spectacle of tradition and pride, polished shoes, starched uniforms, flags that whispered history with every movement. Brass gleamed, sabers clinked, and the scent of fresh roses lingered in the air. Frank hadn't worn his dress blues in decades, but Jasmine had surprised him with a brand new set tailored just for the occasion. The crimson stripe down the trousers, the chevrons, the campaign ribbons, all restored with care. When he stepped into the room on Jasmine's arm, heads began to turn, and a path slowly cleared before them, not from formality but from reverence. They were seated near the front, alongside generals and dignitaries, but Frank remained quiet, his cane resting neatly beside his chair. He studied the faces in the room, young Marines fresh out of training, old ones with silver hair and distant eyes. These were his people, scattered across generations, connected by something deeper than words. And for the first time in a long time, Frank felt like he wasn't carrying their memory alone. They were here, all of them, in spirit and steel. When the master of ceremonies took the podium and tapped the microphone, the chatter in the room dissolved into silence. He recited the birth of the Corps, the values of honor, courage, and commitment, and then he paused. His voice dropped a note in tone. Tonight, before we continue with our traditions, we recognize a man whose quiet dignity reminded our nation of the Marine spirit we so often overlook. Staff Sergeant Frank Delaney, your story didn't just inspire, it reignited. You reminded us what it means to wear the uniform long after it's been folded away. Frank felt a weight settle in his chest. The MC motioned for him to stand. Jasmine helped him rise, and he walked slowly to the stage, applause following each measured step. By the time he reached the podium, the entire room was on its feet. Hundreds of Marines, old and young, stood shoulder to shoulder, honoring a man who had once been invisible. Frank gripped the sides of the lectern and leaned forward. He didn't have a speech prepared. He never did. But he had something better, the truth. When I was a boy, he began, my grandfather told me that serving your country was the highest form of love. Not the kind you speak about. The kind you live. I didn't understand it until I found myself in a foxhole, under fire, wondering if I'd ever see another sunrise. He let the silence settle before continuing. I've carried the weight of stories that were never told. Of brothers who never came home. Of medals that never found their way into boxes. I thought silence was part of the job. I thought invisibility was the cost. But then something happened. A woman on a plane told me to move, and I stayed seated. Not in defiance, but in memory. And suddenly, the world saw something they'd forgotten, a black Marine who served, bled, and kept serving in his own quiet way. There wasn't a sound in the room. Even the clinking of glasses had stopped. I didn't come here to be a symbol, he said. But if standing still reminded this country that its veterans deserve dignity, then I'll take that seat again every single day. He paused, then added, and I hope to God none of you ever forget your brothers and sisters in arms, especially the ones you don't see. Because silence may be heavy, but remembering each other, that's what makes us whole. He stepped back from the mic. The room erupted in thunderous applause. Not just clapping, but roaring, boots stomping, chairs shaking, men and women pounding the tables with fists and open hands. Jasmine wiped tears from her eyes. A general on the front row saluted sharply, and others followed. One by one, rows of Marines raised their hands in salute, not as a formality, but as an act of reverence. Frank stood there, hand over heart, the light catching the gold glint of his long-delayed medal. But his eyes weren't focused on the spotlight or the flags behind him. He was looking at them, all of them. Every Marine, every face, every soul connected by service and sacrifice. He saw Charlie. He saw Jerome. He saw the quiet men who had sat in silence for decades. And he knew, finally, they were no longer invisible. When the evening drew to a close, people lined up to shake his hand. Some offered hugs. Some whispered stories. Some just nodded, eyes wet, unable to speak. Jasmine stayed close, letting him take his time, never once hurrying him through the crowd. Later that night, back in the hotel room, Frank sat on the edge of the bed, slowly removing his jacket. Jasmine folded it with care, laying it across the armchair. He looked at her and smiled. Think I did all right? She leaned in and kissed his forehead. You reminded a room full of warriors why they started fighting. Frank turned to the window. The city lights flickered below like stars that had come to rest. He took a breath, deep and full. That's enough for me, he said. And for the first time, not just in years but in a lifetime, Frank Delaney felt complete. He had stood still. And the world, finally, had stood with him. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?